Before we begin, I'd like to give a brief background. She holds a BA in International Developmental Studies from the University of Toronto, a Master's in Russian and Eastern European Studies from the University of Toronto, and a PhD in Political Science from Brandeis University. She's currently teaching at the Creative Forces College in Toronto. Her research focuses on the politics of state building in divided societies, especially on internationally sponsored state building, nationalism and ethnic conflict, politics of memory, and various aspects of comparative genocide studies. And she's currently serving on the advisory council of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and that's how we came to know each other, because in July, Iyad and myself were present at the conference in Buenos Aires, where we presented and submitted a resolution for genocide recognition. So tonight, Dr. Catic is going to discuss the moral claims and political demands in the context of genocide recognition, as well as the issue of recognition and the viability of genocide recognition.
A couple of things that I would like to do first. Some of the sort of more boring and definitional issues, but I just want to tell you where I come from to the question of genocide recognition, because it's a slightly different angle than it is for many of you here. You're all practitioners, so you have an interest in the Circassian genocide issue because it's a question of personal commitment. I'm an academic. And so I study this as an academic from the perspective of the politics of it. And I think that if there's something that I can bring to this discussion, it's probably sort of the comparative aspect and some of the lessons and the strategies that have been employed by other groups in very similar but also somewhat different circumstances. So I wanted to begin by asking sort of the three questions about genocide recognition in terms of the who, the what, and the why. And just to sort of clear out the way in terms of, what exactly are we talking about before I can say a few things about particularly the Ukrainian and the Bosnian cases. I can talk about the Armenian as well, but the article was on Ukrainian and Bosnian. And then perhaps tell you what I think, what I've gathered so far about the Circassian case. About the who of the genocide recognition, I think that the question here is the one about the agents of recognition and the targets of recognition. And by this I mean who are the entities that are pursuing genocide recognition, and there's no question that in the vast majority of cases it's ethnic groups. I like to think of this as in terms of transnations, because we're now talking about a globalized world where ethnic groups we're talking about entities that connect the homeland-based groups with the diasporas. So oftentimes it's the ethnic groups like the Ukrainians or the Circassians or the Armenians or the Bosnians. And in some instances there is a state here at stake too, because some of these groups have managed to obtain statehood, and so the state becomes the agent of recognition. But I think that it's important to remember that that the groups who pursue genocide recognition are in fact ethnic groups. And then the targets of recognition are, for the most part, other states. And the targets of recognition are other states that are either directly responsible for the crimes of genocide in question, or are entities that are in some ways related. So that with respect to, say, the Ukrainian case, it's the Soviet state that is the responsible party, but the target of the recognition initiative is the Russian Federation. And these are important questions because when it comes to legal questions, there's the question of legal continuity. And so I think that for your own case, you're probably faced with this issue because it has been 150 years, and so the entity in question has gone through several lives. There was a Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union, and now we're talking about the Russian Federation. But in essence, it's almost like you know a state that's a target when you see one. From the legal perspective, it's a bit of a different question. So those are the agents and targets of recognition. Now, in terms of what is it that we mean by genocide recognition? I think that we can recognize that recognition becomes an issue in cases where no recognition exists. Whether it's the active policy of denial, of a particular crime in question, or whether it is that the groups are pursuing genocide recognition because the label itself is extremely important, even in cases where there is an acknowledgement of an injustice. But I want to sort of submit to you that one of the useful ways to think about genocide recognition in terms of the question of what it is, that there are really three elements to this. One of them is juridical, another one is political, and the third one is academic. And I think it's an important thing to consider from the perspective of the recognition initiative of the people who are behind this, who are pushing for this kind of strategy. So what do I mean by juridical recognition of genocide? Well, very simply, in some instances you would have the cases of genocides that have been recognized as such legally in cases of proceedings in courts, whether international or domestic courts, based on the Genocide Convention. So very simply, you can think of the Rwandan case or even the Bosnian case as enjoying juridical recognition because they have been courts, International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia or for Rwanda, or in the case of Bosnia too, you have the International the International Court of Justice, the World Court, that actually establishes state responsibility for involvement in genocide. And then there are the more difficult cases like the Armenian, the Ukrainian, or the Circassian, where the question of juridical recognition is very difficult, simply because, well, two things. One of them is that these are events that have taken place before the Genocide Convention was enacted in 1948. So the question of applicability is one, but there is also another question, and that is simply the difficulty of putting these cases in the settings of the courts. And I discussed this briefly last night, that in some of these instances you have had one of the strategies that have been pursued by other groups has been quasi-judicial recognition, so that for the Ukrainians and the Armenians, there have been two very successful attempts to actually mimic juridical cases. In the case of the Armenians, there was a permanent people's tribunal which was conducted in 1985, I believe, and the Ukrainians have managed in 1990 to call upon the international, I will get the name wrong, a commission essentially a commission of prominent jurists to discuss whether in fact the Ukrainian famine of 1932 constitutes genocide. So those are the instances where genocide recognition was sort of recognized in instances that mimic legal proceedings of the courts or the tribunals. Similar to this, the Ukrainians and the Armenians have very successfully turned to the source of, the source, I would say, when it comes to questions of definitions of genocide, and essentially have relied on the writings of Raphael Lemkin. So that in a lot of Lemkin's writings that led to his work on the enactment of the Genocide Convention, Lemkin has in fact referred to historical cases of genocide. So the Armenian case and a lot of references to Soviet genocides at the time as pertaining to the 1920s and the 1930s, as well as early 40s, have been present in his writing and have been sort of sourced as an additional element to provide recognition. Now, political recognition, I think, is probably the most difficult one, not only in terms of attaining it, but also in terms of defining it. I mean, what do we mean when we talk about political recognition of genocide? And here I think that there are two elements to keep in mind. One of them is the rhetorical or the discursive, so that you would get relevant political bodies, namely other states. And again, keeping in mind that the actual target of these initiatives is the perpetrator state, or the state that's related to it. But that given that this state is usually the one that doesn't want to recognize it, groups have relied on getting recognition from other political bodies, namely states, such as the United States, which is probably the most important one. The state of Israel has been an important ally for a lot of these states, and it has been a target because of its presumed moral standing as the state of a people that was subject to genocide. But also the United Nations has been, in fact, for the Ukrainians, the United Nations has been the target of recognition initiatives, so getting a recognition from the United Nations. the European Union and its various organizations, the Canadian government as well. And I think that I should probably tell the audience that the Canadian government, for example, recognizes the case of the Armenians and the Ukrainians as genocide. It has been a decision of the Canadian Parliament in recent decade, I believe. But beyond this, I mean, what does it mean for a state to recognize a particular genocide, right? I mean, is it enough for a state, for its legislative body, a parliament or a Congress, a Senate, to simply pass a resolution that recognizes a particular case as genocide? And I think that here, I've had this discussion here with Iyad, and I understand that the discursive recognition is something that's very important from the perspective of the victimized group, because there is power in acknowledgement. Oftentimes, recognition initiatives are enacted because of the lack of acknowledgement of the kinds of crimes that have taken place and the suffering of the people who have been subject to them. But from the perspective of the actual goals of recognition, is the resolution of the American Senate enough? I mean, and what does it mean? And I want to suggest here that in addition to this rhetorical and discursive practice of recognition, which is important, that the actual recognition in sort of political terms is something that has to go beyond. And in some instances, I think that, you know, on certain levels, there may be some signs that in some instances it has gone beyond. And what I mean here is that as a result of political recognition, whether it's by the French Parliament or the Canadian Parliament, that the real political recognition consists of a shift in a public policy of a particular state. So that when the United States recognizes an event to constitute genocide, that the policy of the United States, domestically and in foreign terms, is actually reflecting this. So very recently, you might have, you know, observed this in the news. The French Parliament has recognized the Armenian genocide as genocide for many decades. But as a result of this recognition, the French Parliament has passed a law on denial, so that now it is a crime in France to deny the Armenian genocide. And I think this is one of the, you know, sort of one of the examples, of the tangible examples, what it means to have political recognition. In the United States, similarly, probably the biggest shift in the U.S. policy when it comes to issues pertaining to the recognition of, say, the Ukrainian or the Armenian case or the Circassian case would be a shift in foreign policy towards Turkey and Russia. But we'll all agree probably that this is a very difficult thing. So I just want to sort of drive, the message is that the political recognition comes in many forms, but that the deep political recognition is a shift in policy of a particular state in light of the recognition that a certain event constitutes genocide. And then the third axis of recognition, if you wish, is the academic or the scholarly. And I think that this is an extremely important aspect, because it has been at a source. I mean, for many of these initiatives, it's the academic aspect that goes hand in hand with the other two that are being pursued. And by academic, I mean, essentially this is the recognition in academic circles by historians, political scientists, or the genocide scholars that a particular event does constitute genocide. But it's, again, this is a horrible word, but it's normalizing a particular event in the context of a genocide discourse. So that for many successful initiatives, and I do consider the Armenian and Ukrainian to be successful, you've gone from a period in, say, 1960s, where the Armenians have pretty much not been active on this issue at all, have not talked about 1915, to today, where you have endowed chairs in Armenian genocide studies, where you have non-Armenians pursuing study of the Armenian genocide as sort of a legitimate academic endeavor. That's not only an academic endeavor. I mean, it's contributing to something more. So that scholarly recognition, and particularly the one that normalizes it in the community, that goes beyond the ethnic community in question, I think, is something that's very important. And needless to say, that groups that have pursued recognition initiatives have actually looked to all three of those as part of their strategy, with various degrees of success. Now, I was asked to talk specifically about the Ukrainian and the Bosnian case, and I just want to suggest that from this perspective, I mean, these are state-led initiatives, and I have originally focused on them because for the Bosnian case and the Ukrainian case, and I'll tell you a little bit more about each, they have been state-led initiatives in the Ukrainian case, even though it was something that was started by the Ukrainian diaspora in North America. Following independence, the Ukrainian state has become engaged, and it has not always been an easy task, given the politics in Ukraine, and particularly the relationship with Russia. But it is something certainly that has become part of the foreign policy of Ukraine, and it was the Ukrainian ambassador at the permanent mission in New York that has taken this as a cause. Now, when I talk about the case of Bosnia, there are several things to keep in mind. In the Bosnian case, and I here mean events that have taken place from 1992 to 1995 with respect to the Bosnian War, that has been a recognition initiative on behalf of the Bosnian Muslim leadership. And this is perhaps something that, from the perspective of motive and the kind of goals that were being pursued, is the case that has relevance for the Circassian case, although it's very different from one simple. Well, one important difference is the fact that the Bosnian state was a recognized international, was a state that was recognized internationally. So it was an entity that could actually invoke the Genocide Convention in the 1990s and could actually fight this in the International Court of Justice. And so the initiative actually dates back to 1992. And the strategy, in fact, has been a very basic survival strategy that was invoked by the Bosniak leadership at the time to get the international community involved in stopping the conflict, to essentially provoke international intervention. But it has not died out in the aftermath of the war, and it has been used by the Bosnian Muslim leadership to put forward several political demands. Now, you're probably familiar with the war and the fact that it actually ended in 1995 as a result of the Dayton Peace Agreement. But as a result of the Dayton Peace Agreement, Bosnia was recognized as an independent state, but a very decentralized state that was shared between an entity that was controlled by the Bosnian Serbs and an entity that was shared between the Bosnian Muslims and the Bosnian Croats. And from the perspective of the Bosnian Muslims, who saw themselves as being the victims of violence and genocide during the conflict, this was an extremely unjust settlement, and therefore the invocation of genocide and the recognition of genocide that went beyond what was going on in the courts. And in fact, the Bosniaks have pursued recognition similar to what the Circassians have been doing, working on getting the resolutions passed in the American Congress, in the Canadian Parliament, in the context of many EU member states, with simply the goal of overhauling the Dayton structure, so that there was a recognition that 1995 peace settlement was unjust, and that the recognition initiative was actually used for very specifically targeted political goals, namely the establishment of the kind of state that they thought was something that they deserved on account of the fact that they were the victims of genocide. And so, from this perspective, I think that this is the one case that has immediate relevance. Now, the question, of course, here is that how effective has this been, not only in the case of Bosnia, but also in the other cases. And this is sort of the other third question, of genocide recognition initiatives, in addition to who the actors are and what do we mean by recognition. And this is probably the most important question, as to why do we pursue those? Or rather, the groups that do pursue genocide recognition, why do they do it? And I think that I spoke just briefly about the political demands, but I sort of want to go back and mention the other two. One of them is the notion that genocide recognitions are important simply because they establish truth, and truth is important and powerful, and they're also important because they memorialize the victims, and they're important for the healing of a particular group and the survivors. The second one is this notion that genocide recognitions are there because the more we know about past injustices, the better we can escape the new ones. And for a lot of these initiatives, the notion that recognition is something that contributes to prevention of genocide. Now, I'm very skeptical about this because, unfortunately, the more genocides we have recognized in the past 2 decades has not mean that we've seen a decrease in the kinds of human rights violations or instances of genocidal violence. So I think that in principle, perhaps this remains an important goal for people who do pursue. The very fact that we know more about the past does not mean that it doesn't repeat itself. In fact, one could argue that it repeats itself with vengeance in the last several decades. And the third one is exactly the notion that the recognition of genocide has very targeted political goals. So that from the perspective, say, of the Circassian case, and do correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the observation that I can make, is that if you consider the Circassians, like many other groups, as a nation that has two components, the homeland-based and the diasporic component, then I think we can talk about two sort of sets of political goals that are, of course, very interrelated. And one of them is that from the perspective of the Circassian diaspora, the question of genocide becomes a question of the urgency of preserving the national identity in the diaspora. Now, we know from other cases that the precariousness of identity in the diasporic context is a real threat, and that pressures to assimilate are very real, and that there is a notion that somehow anchoring a national identity in an event that in fact brought about the diaspora. I mean, the very notion that a lot of scholars talk about, victim diasporas, the fact that many diasporas today are results of horrendous events in the past, so that there is a continuity between, the event that has produced the diaspora, which is the case in the Circassian context, but also in some other contexts as well, that there is a continuity between that and the ongoing practices that pertain to the loss of identity in the diaspora itself. But I think also importantly is that the notion of what goes on in the homeland, and here again, the notion that anchoring the demand for, say, ethno-cultural rights in the Russian Federation, or if one takes a perhaps more aggressive stance in terms of the kind of political settlement that would be satisfactory, where you go from sort of wide ethno-cultural autonomy to independence, but arguing for political rights on the account of past victimization is something that becomes very important, and this is where the notion of having these moral claims translate into political rights. Now, this in itself is a very recent development. I mean, it's something that goes back to about maybe 2 decades, because the notion of invoking these moral claims that's based on victimization is quite new, but there has been a shift, I think, in sort of international relations and the international stance, and the notion that somehow groups would put forward rights for autonomy or rights for self-government. The competition has become very stiff, and so there is a particular view among certain scholars is that you can no longer simply claim that you are a recognizable national group and therefore you deserve a particular set of rights, but that in fact you have to produce a moral claim, because this gives more legitimacy to Group A over Group B, and so lending that legitimacy to the kinds of demands becomes sort of the function of genocide recognition. Okay, well, I talked too much. I mean, I really want this to sort of be an interactive, right. So I'll stop here and then just have a conversation rather than